Well, hi everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. I'm going to talk about fair trade, but we have a pretty small crowd tonight, so I'm totally happy to make it fairly informal. And I'll also just list off so Carrie knows who's on the call with us. So Vincent, Catherine, Susan, Elise, Margaret, I see just joined, and myself. So yeah, pretty small crowd. And, if other people join as we go through it, that's fine too. And I encourage everyone, if you have any questions, just feel free to put up your hand or do something to stop me or interrupt me. I won't get offended if you interrupt me because I prefer to sort of make it more of a conversation and answer questions as we go. It's not a super long presentation, but there's a few slides, and then we can also have questions at the end as well. And I'll give a bit of context on why I'm doing this. So I'm a fairly new member to the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good. Engineers Without Borders joined in, I think, April of last year. And Fair Trade Calgary is a venture within Engineers Without Borders. And so we've been working as part of our campaign. It's been to try to designate Calgary as a fair trade town. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but a lot of people don't necessarily are not necessarily all on the same page about what fair trade is. And so I'm going to go into what it is, and I'll provide you some clarity. I mean, there's a lot of gray areas as well, and I'll sort of explain some of those gray areas, but I'll explain to you from our perspective what we consider to be fair trade and what makes a town be a designated fair trade town and why we call it town instead of city and those types of things. And feel free to ask questions as we go. And then I'll also just explain what our ask is of Calgary Alliance members, because we're hoping in order to get the designation, we need a certain number of letters of support from community groups. And so at the end, I'll explain what that ask is. And if you're able to help, then feel free to reach out to me after the presentation as well. So I'm going to share my screen. I just have a PowerPoint presentation that I will go through. And I think you can you see my screen? Yes. Okay, great. So let's talk fair trade. So a quick little agenda. I'll go over what about Fair Trade Calgary. I'll explain fair trade. I'll explain some of the benefits of fair trade. I'll talk about our Fair Trade Town campaign. And as I said, questions throughout and questions at the end if you have any.
Do you address Engineers Without Borders at all in there somewhere?
I can, yes. So, Fair Trade Calgary is part of Engineers Without Borders. I have to say, Engineers Without Borders, the name of it was because it was founded by an engineer, and it was always focused around engineering groups at universities primarily, who were wanting to go to sub-Saharan Africa, countries in Africa, to provide aid. And the aid used to be in the form of services, some very similar to Doctors Without Borders, where they would, do projects in those countries. But Engineers Without Borders has changed their mandate quite significantly, where it's more about empowering entrepreneurs within those countries and actually facilitating knowledge sharing between Canada and sub-Saharan African countries and even other countries around the world. So the model of Engineers Without Borders changed significantly, where it's not just doing projects for other people or giving aid, but it's about funding collaborative projects that will empower local knowledge. So, and they never did change the name from engineers, just because it's kind of traditionally been known as Engineers Without Borders. But I would say a lot of our membership are not engineers. I mean, I happen to be an engineer, but a lot of our members are non-engineers, maybe in international development, social work, all sorts of different fields. So we definitely are not restrictive to you have to be an engineer to be part of our group. And yeah, Fair Trade Calgary is just one venture within Engineers Without Borders. We also have another really key venture called Water Movement, which is around bringing clean water to Indigenous communities and supporting water technicians Indigenous water technicians to run the water plants and keep clean water in Indigenous communities. So that's another venture that Engineers Without Borders helps sponsor in Calgary specifically. Fair Trade Calgary, we're also aligned to a couple of other national organizations. So the Canadian Fair Trade Network is a grassroots nonprofit type group that was created in Vancouver by Sean McHugh. He's the executive director of that organization, and it's really meant to be a networking, collaborative type organization where we have business members, we have members of people who belong to certain certifying bodies related to fair trade, and it's in Canada. And then there's also the certifying bodies themselves that we are aligned to, but we're not only exclusive to them. It's just that they administer some of these programs like a Fair Trade Town program or a Fair Trade School program. So Fair Trade Canada is the certifier for Canada. So if you want to have a fair trade label on a Canadian product, you have to go through Fair Trade Canada to get that be a certified fair trade carrier. And if you're international, if you're a international co-op and you want to provide fair trade goods, you have to get audited by Fair Trade International and certified and have permission to use the label on your good. So that's a little bit about Fair Trade Calgary. So we're aligned into many different organizations, and we're promoting local fair trade choices for global voices. So having choices at a local level that are also going to provide a ripple effect and empower people at a global scale. And it's also just around transparency in the supply chain and providing inclusion and equity for marginalized people and focusing on small producers, really the small producers that maybe only own like a hectare of land or not very big parcels of land, really those small scale producers who often don't have a large voice in the supply chain. I say it's a small world. This is a quote from Martin Luther King: "Before you finished your breakfast this morning, you'll have relied on half the world." And I think it's just points to the fact that we sometimes are oblivious to the fact that we source so many of our goods, whether it be food, whether it be even clothing, even skincare products. We source all of those ingredients come from all over the world and often are not grown in Canada or not grown in our home area. So we don't necessarily realize that, or we don't acknowledge it every day, but we really do rely on many other countries to afford us the convenience and the comfort that we have. The problem around why we need fair trade is that there are several imbalances. So we see that there's child labor problems where 2.1 million children work on cocoa farms and often don't actually get paid, or the families don't get paid. The children are just meant to work and are basically kept as slaves. We also have 50 million people in the tea industry, and most are working on plantations that have poor living conditions. I think a lot of people have heard about the Rana Plaza collapse in Bangladesh, where there were unsafe conditions for garment workers and they weren't being treated with respect and with dignity. And we also have environmental problems where we see that commercial bananas use 10 times the necessary amount of pesticides that are harming the waterways and the environment in the area. So those are just some of the problems that basically provided a reason for why we need to think of how we do trade differently. And this next slide is about a pet peeve I have, because a lot of people get fair trade mixed up with free trade. And they're two very, very different things. So I just wanted to clarify, when we say free trade, we're talking about, trade between borders or across borders. And, being able to have free trade is about having an agreement with across borders that is maybe going to limit the tariffs or limit the restrictions on how we move goods across the borders. Whereas fair trade is about, the actual minimum standards that we're going to put in place to protect people both on how much they're getting paid and other social, economic, and standards. I have a couple of photos on this slide, and it's showing different types of produce and even just meat and chocolate. So banana, and I put some prices beside them just to show you kind of, it's basically trying to illustrate that there is an imbalance and a broken system when it comes to food. When you look at a banana, this banana happens to come from Mexico. You're paying 70 cents a pound, and it's coming 5,000 kilometers to get here. We think of blueberries, they're coming from Argentina, they're $5 a package, and they're traveling 11,000 kilometers to get here. Strawberries, they're only coming from California, so not quite as far. They're $6 a package and 3,000 kilometers away. An apple that's grown locally in BC, only 1,000 kilometers from us, is still $3.99. So you can compare, like, especially when you look at the banana and how cheap the banana is, and then look at how much like a local apple from BC is, it just logically, and like I said, I'm an engineer, I think of like logically, this does not make sense. And then when you look at chocolate bars, I put two prices. One is if you buy a chocolate bar at Walmart, you'll pay $1 for a chocolate bar. If you buy it at Villages, which is a fair trade store, you'll pay $6.50. And you can see there's quite a variance between, okay, if you're paying a fair trade price at $6.50, where people are actually able to make a living wage, it's a lot more than $1 at Walmart. And who's paying for that extra money? It's at the expense, or it's at the life expense of the people who are making that product. And when you think of chocolate too, it's a composite product. It's coming mainly, the sugar and the chocolate might be coming from Peru. It's traveling 7,800 kilometers to get here. There's a lot of factors that go into our food, and we don't always think about what should be the cost and what is the actual cost. So what is fair trade? So fair trade, as two words definition, is a fair price paid to workers for their product. But when we talk about certifications, oftentimes we're looking for a more comprehensive definition. The fair trade, one word, so fair trade together, that's a certain certification. And on that, they also look at that a product can be purchased directly from cooperatives, that the minimum price acts as a safety net, but the minimum price doesn't necessarily mandate the only price that is paid to workers. Environmentally responsible practices must be used, including asking about like waste diversion, asking about how chemicals are disposed of safely, how safety measures are applied for workers who have to work near pesticides. And then there's a premium. So a lot of rigorous fair trade certifications will have a premium that's paid on top of the minimum price. And that premium is specifically dedicated to community initiatives. So it's an amount of money that's put forward and democratically decided on by the producers for them to invest in whichever way makes the most sense for them. And I can talk a bit more about premiums, because how we think premiums should be spent is very different from how the producer community might think they need to spend that money. And a prime example is that we had a couple of guest speakers that came to a Fair Trade conference a number of years ago. And it was one sugar producer from Paraguay who came and was telling us about, they had their fair trade premium, and the first investment that they actually put their premium towards was buying donkeys. And to us, it's like, well, why do you need donkeys? Like, why would that be important to your business? And he said, well, the sugar cane grows on these very hilly expanses, where we can't drive a vehicle up to get the sugarcane down. We have these goat trails that basically go up, and the only way to get that sugarcane down is to cut it and then transport it on donkeys down the hills so that we can actually get them to the vehicles, so that we can transport them on roads to the plant where they have to be processed. And because sugarcane will ferment after a certain time after it's been cut, it's really important to be able to have the equipment or the animals or whatever you need, the transportation in place, so that you're able to process that sugarcane in the amount of time that you need to make it a viable product. So to them, having extra donkeys available to the cooperative to aid in just getting the sugarcane down to, be able to transport it was critical to them, but not something necessarily that we would think as a North American, supplier or brand or whatever, that we would think is important for us to think they would want to invest in. So it's interesting that the decision making has to come from the producer, and it's again about acknowledging that we don't know best for others, and that when we let them make their own decisions, they make the best decisions for what they need. So this international certification, Fair Trade, one word, it's an international certification. It's the most recognized mark of fair trade. It's the blue and white kind of guy waving his hands symbol. And some of the key aspects of that certification, we call it kind of the gold standard of certifications, is that it's focused on products. So it's not focused on a specific brand or brand having power over that producer cooperative. So say, a producer has the label on them, they're able to sell to whichever brands they want to. So they're not restricted. They have the label, it goes with the product, and you're able to trace it that way. There's third-party auditing that happens, both to make sure that the premiums being applied properly, that the fair minimum price is being applied properly, that there's environmental sustainable practices, certain pesticides are not allowed to be used, that there's a long-term relationship with the supplier so that, they are able to plan for the future. And it's 100% of the product gets audited. So some other certifications, and I'll go into a couple of the other certifications that you might find in the store. They have auditing, but they don't necessarily have third-party auditing, where it's basically an objective person who does the auditing, and they don't necessarily always have 100% auditing, where they might just do 30% auditing, or they might do self-auditing, which it means that the brand is basically checking themselves, which is not necessarily that objective and could be, falsified. So certifications are confusing because there's a lot of them out there, and it's unfortunate because, certifications pop up because people don't want to necessarily meet the rigorous standards of a certain certification, so they'll just kind of invent their own new one. But these are some of the ones that are, I guess, more widely spread and kind of more well-known. Rainforest Alliance is a big one. Rainforest Alliance certification is not fair trade. They say they're fair trade, but they're actually more about environmental practices, and farming practices. I guess indirectly they benefit farmers because they have those farming practices outlined and you have to comply with them, but they don't actually guarantee a minimum price for any of their products. And Rainforest Alliance also does not do 100% auditing. So they have a certain percentage depending on the product that is being audited. The Fair for Life is another certification out of Europe. I think it's out of Belgium, and they basically piggyback onto the fair trade certification. So if you have fair trade certification, you can get Fair for Life certification, but you don't have to pay them the same fees. So a lot of times people that are doing the right thing will put Fair for Life because they don't have to pay as many fees to get that certification. So it's a bit of a piggyback. Certified Benefit Corporation, or B Corp. That's more of a company type certification. And B Corps are good. They weigh different aspects of business to accumulate a certain number of points. And you can only get certified as a B Corp if you have a certain number of points. And that can include hiring practices for diversity and inclusion, or mentoring programs, or other kind of social benefits within the company. Fair trade, you can also get points for having fair trade certifications included in the products that they're offering. But B Corps, just important to qualify that B Corps is for the company and not necessarily for a product. And then Fair Trade USA, bone of contention, because Fair Trade USA used to be part of the International Fair Trade certification, and then they decided that the rules were too rigorous, so they branched off, and they now have their Fair Trade USA, where they will certify certain pieces of the product. So they might have 32% fair trade certified product, or they might have only the cocoa butter is fair trade certified, or only the sewing, the factory is fair trade certified, but not the cotton. So they tend to sort of piecemeal it a little bit and offer certifications for pieces of the product, but not 100%. Whereas Fair Trade International is more about 100% of the product, 100% along the supply chain. So, I mean, it is a lot more robust and a lot harder to obtain, but it's also more trustworthy. And the UTZ one, I don't know that one as much, but I believe it's also out of Australia, New Zealand. That's another type of certification. I don't know a lot about that one. And then direct trade, because a lot of people say, oh, but we do direct trade and it's way better than fair trade. And I guess it depends on the relationship, because direct trade is a relationship between a brand and a producer. So, and people call themselves direct trade, even if they use a broker to get their coffee for them. So they might not necessarily visit the coffee plantations themselves, but they'll use their broker to advise them on which coffee plantations we should buy from. And those coffee plantations may or may not be having best practices, may or may not be treating their workers the best. The truly direct trade relationships are great. I mean, I totally agree that, if you can have a really trustworthy, honor, have dignity in that relationship, give decision-making power to that producer in that relationship, that's awesome. And pay them, a fair wage and make sure that they're being treated well. But again, where is the power? Is the power in that the brand is deciding what sorts of investments are being made by the producer organization? Or are the producers able to decide that for themselves and tell the brand what they need? So I always, I'm a little bit skeptical about direct trade, just because it depends on how well you know the brand. And sometimes it's hard for us to know how good a brand is. I'll say, the good trade, I know the people who own the good trade, and they go to Colombia all the time. They know the people that are making their coffee. I think they're great. Phil and Sebastian, another really great direct trade brand that visit their producers all the time. They're super. But Cafe Rosso uses a broker. I don't think they go all the time to their producers. So, I always just look and try to consider any red flags or any areas of gray where I don't necessarily think there's robust practices being used, but you never know. And I don't know 100% about all of these different ones. So, but it's just something to consider. Where is the power and who is making the decisions with direct trade? So really robust certifications always have a balance between people, planet, and profit. And especially on the people side, like making sure that people have the decision-making. And the ones that we endorse as Fair Trade Calgary are the Fair Trade International one, which is that little waving man in the green and blue. And then there's the other ones, World Fair Trade Organization. That's a worldwide organization, and they also include certifications of companies who do handmade, So, and jewelry and those types of things as well. Fair Trade Federation based in the US, they also put the producer first, and they have a really great network of businesses in both Canada and the US that are doing some great things and making sure the producers are being paid fairly and following the 10 principles of fair trade. And then the small producers symbol, that's for Latin and South American products primarily, but I think they have gone into Asia and Africa as well. And that's more product based, but again, they're called small producers for a reason. It's because the small producers are the ones making the decision making. And then Fair Trade International also just created a single ingredient certification that's a little bit different, so that if they did want to have a composite product like ice cream and only have the cocoa that's fair trade, they could identify it that way. Or similarly, if a cookie had fair trade sugar or had one ingredient that was fair trade, they could label it that way. So that you might see some things. Actually, I've seen them at London Drugs where there's cookies and they have one ingredient that's fair trade in the cookies. So you can look for those. And yeah, fair trade, 2 words versus fair trade, 1 word. Fair trade, 1 word is the certification, the international certification, and fair trade, 2 words is kind of just the philosophy around, being fair and having a minimum price, but thinking about holistically about good working conditions, environmental standards, reinvestment in community, long-term relationships, and third-party auditing.
Erin?
Yes?
I just wanted to clarify when you were talking about direct trade versus the free trade. The impression I got from what you're saying is it's direct trade because, for example, you mentioned, no, not the coffee place, another place. Anyway, someone goes down to the producer directly. Is that the significance? Is that I go directly to the cocoa producer wherever they're growing it and buy directly from them? Is that strictly it? There's no other regulations around the direct trade labeling?
Yes, that's true. There's no regulations, and that's why every direct trade label that and sorry, you wouldn't have been able to see it because it was on the screen. There is a million different direct trade labels, and they all look slightly different, and they all look, and you'll see McDonald's has, or not McDonald's, Tim Hortons has their own direct trade that they call direct trade. Tim Hortons is the worst offender of anybody trying to greenwash. So I'll just say that right up front. But sorry guys, if you like Timmy's. I used to love Timmy's and now I can't go in there. But yeah, like and Starbucks is another one that they didn't like having to follow the rules, so they created their own Starbucks certification system that they do direct trade, which again I feel is bogus. But yeah, I mean, direct trade unfortunately does not have any rigor around it. But I do appreciate the philosophy of trying to buy directly from a producer and honor that you're paying them a fair, what would be a living wage and a fair wage for their income. So
assuming that you are, of course.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is unless you know intimately how the relationship is between the brand and the direct trade producer, it's really hard for us in North America, not having been there and visited the farmer ourselves, to know that. And it's about the relationships that maybe we have with the brand and how well we know the brand, which is a lot of work and a lot of research on our part to have to do.
Thanks.
Fair Trade Plus, I'm just going to mention Fair Trade Plus because we on purpose added this to Fair Trade Calgary's initiatives, because we wanted to recognize that, so Fair Trade, the certifications are only for products that are grown in southern countries, like southern world countries. So you can't find a North American product, like you can't find an apple that's grown in BC that has a fair trade sticker on it. And that's because the certification only applies to small scale farmers that are coming from southern world countries. So Fair Trade Plus is a way for us to acknowledge that fair trade should be universal. fair trade principles about paying people fairly, having environmental sustainable practices, having no child labor, no slave labor, dignified work. That should be universal, whether it's here in Canada. And, it's surprising that there's a lot of things that go on with, migrant workers and fair trade not being adhered to even in our own home country, that we tend to turn a blind eye to. So that's why we just wanted to recognize that there's fair trade as far as the certification stuff, and then there's fair trade plus, which should be universal no matter what country and where that product is coming from. And so we just emphasize that you should know and appreciate your farmer and producer and pay them fairly for what they're providing to you. And a lot of the products we're talking about are agricultural, but can be clothing, it could be, it could be bamboo, it could be hemp, it could be anything really that's grown. If those producers are not being treated fairly, they should be. I also just mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's certain ones that link directly to fair trade and our fair trade mission, which is, around no poverty, zero hunger, reduced inequalities. Responsible consumption and production is kind of a no-brainer, but also decent work and economic growth, climate action, gender equality, and then partnership for the goals. So those are some of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, that we like to highlight when we talk about the work that we're doing, just because a lot of people are looking at the SDGs as kind of our markers, our place markers for knowing where we're going and trying to be a more sustainable world. The ripple effect that supporting fair trade has is that you can focus on the relationship with the producer. Especially with the premiums in particular, the way Fair Trade International reinvests premiums, they do it in leadership for women programs, empowerment. A lot of the countries where some of the products are grown are very patriarchal. And so a lot of times women aren't encouraged to be part of the cooperative or be part of the decision making. So it's important that those programs are put in place. And a lot of times premiums might go towards investing in leadership or women leader programs. Climate change is a big one. There's a picture below where the farmers there holding some leaves, and that's coffee leaves that have the coffee rust on them. And it's been a decimating infection for coffee plantations to have this coffee rust. It basically just infects their whole crop, and it's basically a pest that gets onto the plant and then just basically wipes out their whole plantation, so they can't actually yield any harvest. And it's because of climate change, it's because of the drought and the lack of moisture that doesn't come consistently at the times that we're used to. Now we have the flood or we have the severe drought, and it's hard to regulate the amount of water that the plants can get. And so then these pests come up and basically, ruin the crops. So part of the premiums also go towards, and in the network of fair trade, are trying to educate about how can we be more resilient in our farming to prevent the coffee rust from happening, from being able to provide a steady stream of water and nutrients to the soil and to the plants. There's a lot around, healthy soils and agronomics and shared knowledge among cooperatives worldwide to try to prevent or mitigate basically climate change from happening. And then women's health services and maternity leave. Like a lot of times women are working in cooperatives, small scale cooperatives, and oftentimes they need to be able to take maternity leave to have a kid, or they need to be able to put their kids somewhere because they're also being a breadwinner for the family, but they need to also lead their family and be healthy for their family. So a lot of times premiums go towards health programs or childcare programs. So this is also ways in which supporting fair trade has a ripple effect because it allows for those programs to be funded. For businesses, some of the benefits of supporting fair trade are that a lot of people have ethical consumption on the radar. A lot of people want to say that they're supporting ethical brands or trying to be as ethical as they can be when they're buying their food or buying their products. So fair trade can be a differentiator for businesses. And that's also why we tend to see a lot of greenwashing. So that's why it's also important to make sure that there's rigorous standards that are being upheld and being supported. There's a lot of people that recognize the international fair trade mark, which is great. And that's definitely a positive thing. And we say that, you know, if everyone was to buy fair trade products every day, there's hundreds of small decisions that are being made that would have a ripple effect to be able to improve the lives of producers. So we are very hopeful and appreciate seeing that movement grow quite a bit. And then the people who are at the center of it, it's really, you know, about seeing their communities thrive and knowing that we're a part of that and knowing that we're helping to make the world a better place. I know it's kind of corny to say that, but that's really what it is all about, is that, you know, we're all linked in a network. And something that's happening halfway across the world is also affecting us. So we saw that with COVID. We see that every day, even though sometimes we might be oblivious to it, but we are all connected, and things that are good for people in other countries are also good for us. And we build resilience that way, global resilience, by protecting our local food, or the small scale food sources. Some fair trade products that you might not know are fair trade. You know, coffee, tea, and cocoa are kind of the basics that a lot of people know about, but you can get fair trade roses. Some Safeways and Sobeys actually do sell fair trade roses. There's also a fair trade rose distributor, Florist Supply Limited, here in Calgary. You can get bananas. Now Sobeys and Safeways carries fair trade bananas across all Canadian stores. You can sometimes find grapefruits, mangoes, and avocados as fair trade, although those tend to be kind of seasonal and I don't find them at every store. Coconut and olive oil can be fair trade, rice, quinoa, wine. There's a couple of fair trade wines that I really like. Believer is a really great one from Argentina. Spirits, there aren't any fair trade spirits in Alberta yet, but there are some in Toronto and Ontario. Sports balls, you can find soccer balls that are fair trade made in Pakistan. And cotton is a little bit of a growing thing where you can find, you know, bed linens, towels that are fair trade. And if you ever want to know where to find any of these things as fair trade, just let me know, because I know I have all the connections. I know where to find all this stuff. And plus our website is a great resource as well. The Fair Trade Town designation. So really, there is a designation, and it's a program that's administered by Fair Trade Canada. So it is that Canadian certifier that administers the program. And so as part of, in order to achieve a Fair Trade Town designation, it is linked to the international certification. And I just clarify that because a lot of times people say, well, you know, what about all the fair trade that's not certified? And yes, in principle, we should be supporting fair trade, whether it's certified or not. But being a fair trade town does show leadership and does show, you know, a robust acceptance of fair trade products in a city. And so that's part of the reason why we want to become a fair trade town. Some of the requirements that we need in order to get there. We already have a steering committee created. The one missing piece on our steering committee is we're supposed to have a counselor, a city councilor on that steering committee. So we're still lacking city support, like city active championing of city council. So that's one aspect where we're still missing the mark. Availability of product, we have way more than the 143 retailers and grocers that need to carry at least 2 fair trade products. We far exceed that in Calgary, which is great. We have over 200 individual retailers and grocers. For our cafes and restaurants, we're lacking. We're quite low. We only have identified about 11 cafes and restaurants that have 2 fair trade products offered. And unfortunately, like direct trade doesn't count. uncertified fair trade or unlabeled fair trade products don't count. So we're still trying to look for another 60 so cafes and restaurants that would provide at least 2 fair trade products in Calgary. And maybe they're out there, maybe they're in the woodwork, but I haven't been able to find an efficient way of finding out where those restaurants and cafes are and what products they offer. Community support, part of the reason was we wanted to have letters of support from community groups. We have quite a few letters of support already. We're kind of at the final hump here where we just need about 10 more letters of support in order to get our designation. And then the municipal support I mentioned, we're kind of lacking because we need to get a councillor on board to our steering committee, and we need them to pass 2 resolutions with council saying that they're going to purchase fair trade coffee, tea, and sugar and support a fair trade down designation. So that's kind of where we're at with the designation piece, and why we're asking for people to, actions that you can take are shop fair trade, talk about fair trade, become a fair trade workplace or a faith group if you like, source fair trade choices for your business, your household, your events, write a letter of support, to get us over that hump, to get the number of letters that we need. We have postcards that people can send to their counselor to tell them that you support Calgary becoming a fair trade town. We always need more volunteers to help with the campaign and do outreach. We also do lunch and learns or awareness sessions at workplaces. If you need us to come in and do a talk at a group meeting, we're happy to do that. And letters of support are fairly simple. We have a little template. You can look at other letters of support that we've gotten from other groups. As I said, it can be from any community group. So we have businesses that write us letters of support. We have churches, we have community associations, we have dance groups, performance groups. It's basically open to anyone who wants to write us a letter of support, just to show that there's widespread support for fair trade in Calgary. And we do have a monthly newsletter if you wanted to stay in the loop on our events. We tend to do both virtual and in-person events. We have a fair trade email, as well as our website, fairtradecalgary.com. And we have a lot of resources on our website if you're looking for fair trade goods, but I also have a lot in my brain. If you need a specific thing, I'm happy to advise. And that's basically the end of my presentation. And if you do have any questions, I am happy to answer them.
I think Susan does to start.
Yes. I don't know if it's so much a question, but maybe you would amplify a little bit about how one speaks to what you suggest might be a moral impairment and the importance of an ethical process that fair trade defines. And if you will, some of the challenges that we're seeing as individuals in inflationary times. And, one example is that contrast between the Walmart item and the fair trade item, and how do, can you address a little bit some of that? How do we reconcile those two? Because I think I have a moral compass, but I also know when faced with the $6.50 chocolate bar, that's not always my choice. And there's a dilemma there in terms of how to reconcile those two values.
Yes. And I totally appreciate that. Yeah, because not everybody has a budget to be able to pay more for their products. And it's interesting because, I brought up the difference in the chocolate bars, but at the same time, Walmart does sell Kicking Horse coffee, which is a fair trade coffee. I can find fair trade products at Bulk Barn. I can actually find fair trade chocolate bars at Bulk Barn and granola that has fair trade chocolate at Bulk Barn. Like it's funny how, despite there's certain products that are grossly there's a grossly broken piece of it, and chocolate is one of them, because chocolate unfortunately has a lot of problems in the supply chain, and unfortunately it's maybe harder to find fair trade chocolate that doesn't cost that doesn't cost more if you want it to be really ethical, because I think there's a lot of problems with the child labor issue, and there's a lot of problems with the whole processing and the way that composite products are made. But I will say that I am not, when I promote fair trade products, I'm not only going to the pricey stores. I on purpose go to the London Drugs and the Shoppers Drug Marts and the bulk barns, and I acknowledge when Walmart sells fair trade products, because I don't think it has to be expensive. It's more about in the supply chain, how many different people are getting paid for not doing very much in the supply chain. And how can we make that relationship a little bit more direct? And that's, it's a complicated issue though. So it's not something where I have a silver bullet and I can wave a wand and all of a sudden it makes it better. But definitely I think being aware of what brands are fair trade and knowing which stores offer those fair trade brands and doing our best, not being perfect, not punishing ourselves for not always buying the right, the most ethical, because it's not practical. You just can't do everything. You can do only as much as you can do. And so I would never shame anyone for saying, Erin, I'm just not going to buy any of that chocolate from Villages because it's too expensive. That's totally fine. Like, don't feel bad about that at all. But just know that if you do want to know where, what is sold at different stores, I have a lot of that information on our website and in my mind. And if you're looking to be on a budget and still support fair trade, there are ways to do it, and you don't have to be perfect at it.
Well, I want to give your talk a plug, because maybe, what you're suggesting and what I'm hearing is, regardless of the dilemma, if you invite me to be a more discerning shopper and look for fair trade, I can be both economical and to the extent possible, and also expound the virtues of the process you're suggesting. But I also think sometimes I see myself as somebody in, privileged that I can make some of those choices. And I think that's not to say we shouldn't go ahead with a campaign and I shouldn't be more discerning. But I also know sometimes I can easily pay the 50 cents, whereas I think lately, the contrast in terms of some of the individual stories that many of us know firsthand are, if you will, somewhat of a, they invite, if you will, sort of how do you balance out those kinds of things. So I thank you, because I will be more discerning when I go to different places now, thanks to your talk.
Yeah, well, thank you. Any other questions?
I have some boring questions, probably because my husband, works at the city. So when you talk about what you need from the city, I'm like, okay, I want clarification here, because you're saying they declare to be, fair trade town. But then there's this comment that you made, they need to be buying tea and coffee and sugar. And then my logistical person's going, okay, so, but there's all these different business units, and some of the business units do their own purchasing, and some of the business units just farm out that kind of stuff to, other organizations. And then they have the arm's length business units that they have influence over, but they don't actually control. And so are you asking the city to basically make a blanket statement that now all of these different aspects all have to buy 100% fair trade, or what are you asking for in that?
No, because I clarified this too. I work at the city as well, so that would be an impossibility.
Right. Yeah. I'm like
that. Yeah. So basically, it's having a commitment from council that at council meetings they will have fair trade coffee, tea, and sugar, because they do have council meetings where they take breaks and they have, refreshments and that. They need to have coffee, tea, and sugar offered for council meetings. The rest of the business unit, it doesn't matter. I mean, obviously, if they pass a resolution, it would be helpful if they could encourage City of Calgary to consider fair trade choices as well, but like an administrative policy around that, but there's it doesn't necessarily have to include that.
So, I mean, budget wise, then it's non-existent as a cost for the city.
Really?
I mean,
And that's the thing is there's
15 counselors. I mean,
Yeah.
come on, like.
Well, and that's the thing is like when we talk to other cities, there's 27 other fair trade towns in Canada. And when we talk to certain ones of them, they're like, yeah, the coffee, tea, sugar was not an issue because it's on par. Like you can find coffee at the same price at fair trade as regular coffee. So it shouldn't be an issue as far as cost. It's not an additional cost. It's just an effort.
So really what we're asking for the city is just the council people to drink fair trade when they have council meetings and to say they're going to make a difference and then have one person appointed to your council.
Yeah. But, and I'll tell you what the conversations have been is that, okay, well, you work on all the other metrics that you have to get done. Like you're not there with the restaurants, you're not there with your letters of support, you're not there with everything else. So you do all the legwork and we'll rubber stamp it at the end. And that's also not what we want because we need somebody, a council member, to be a champion for fair trade and to sit on our steering committee as an active participant. So that's a little bit different than someone just saying, oh, we'll rubber stamp your fair trade designation and go have fun and be fair trade. That's not what we want. We want somebody to be engaged in being a fair trade town. So that's a little bit more of a commitment.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And part of me is going through our council people and going, well, Giancarlo Carlo, he got dumped off all his committees. He's probably bored. You should go approach him.
Well, I have approached Giancarlo, and Giancarlo has been one of the ones that says, let me know when you get there. I'll write the notice of motion, but yeah, just let me know when you have everything done. So that's not good enough. It's not good enough.
Yeah, not good enough. Well, and when Vincent, is it next October that they reappoint themselves to all their different councils again?
So it's called an org day, and they call as many as they like to. So sometimes org is the beginning of the budget process is typically the easiest time, and that's oftentimes at the beginning of October. Sometimes. So sometimes they have like an org day like in the middle of winter. So, but typically, yeah, October.
I wonder if we could get it on an org day, and how do you do that?
Well, it's Mayor Gondek's gone out of her way to host these sort of think of them as like mini cabinet retreats, sort of stealing an idea from the province and the feds, sort of bringing all the councillors and just having them all sit down in like a constructive setting of what's the next 6 months, what's the next 12 months. I don't know. We may know one or two people in the in that office. So
sorry, I'm
we're
strategizing on you, Erin. Sorry.
No, that's awesome.
Like,
thank you.
This seems like this should be doable. Why is this not happening?
Yeah, I always thought that, I work for the city, I should be able to get this done, right? But not quite so easy. I've been on this campaign for 7 years now. So
7 years you've been working at it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
And don't get me wrong, Winnipeg, I think it took them like 10 years or something, but Edmonton did it. I think it took them maybe 2 or 3 years, and they've been a fair trade town for 10 years now. Like Edmonton's a fair trade town.
Oh, well, see, that's what you need to tell people is that Edmonton did it 10 years ago, and then people are like, what? Well, this is embarrassing. You just have to point that out.
That's a great point. Rivalry.
Yes.
Put that rivalry to work.
Yeah. Okay. Did anyone else have any other questions?
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for sticking through my presentation, and I did pretty good without coughing, so I'm pretty happy and really appreciate the great questions. And of course, if you ever think of another question or want to reach out to me at any time, feel free to do so. I'm always available, and as you can tell, I'm passionate about this and I love talking about it. So yeah, always come and see me if you have any questions.
I will be emailing you about, you said, because you know so many products, I will be emailing you to find out more about different products, definitely.
Okay, awesome. I look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you
So-
so much, Erin. It's Margaret here. I really appreciate that. I learned a lot. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
I feel much more confident in making my choices, tea and coffee, etc.
Awesome.
I feel less confident.
Oh no.
And now I'm like, oh, I have more to think about. Oh, shoot.
Yeah, well, and the thing too is, and I do this for everything because I'm trying to go zero waste and plastic free, and there's so many things that we could be doing, and it's just like, just make one small change at a time. Don't take on everything at once. But I started buying sugar as fair trade. I buy coffee as fair trade. Now I have a shampoo bar that I'm using. Like, there's little things, and just do one thing at a time, see how it goes, and then do the next thing.
That's a good way to think about it, Erin. Yeah,
Mhm.
just one bit at a time, one step at a time. Yeah.
Great. Well, everyone have a wonderful evening, and I'm sure we'll see each other again soon. Take care, and thank
yeah.
you.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you.
Bye.